So, I think today what we are discussing is uh, most of us already works in hospital and especially in surgical ward. Is there any surgical resident there? Okay. So, will you tell me ki how many percent of patients of your indoor admissions are having diabetes?
30 to 40%. Sir, 30 to 40%.
Yeah, so that's the scenario. In fact, if you go to cardiac ward and all, almost 50% of patients are having either IGT or at the same time because the numbers are increasing every day. Now, the older criteria of treatment, giving clearance of surgeries are also evolving, and we have to become more pragmatic also. We can no longer say that okay, you bring down the HbA1c to 7 and we'll operate, because that way every 4 or 5 surgeries will get deferred every time. So things are evolving, and the cut off, and sometimes as a branch which we are dealing with these patients, we need to be I think anesthesia people are there. Yeah. So that's why we want to bring this. Sometimes we give clearances for surgery, and knowing that the controls are suboptimal, but situations like cardiac cases, malignancies, or some other emergencies, semi-elective kind of procedures, we have to be pragmatic in terms of managing them intra-hospital management of hyperglycemia, rather than being a very much fixated cutoff of giving clearances for HbA1c. That's the one practical thing which we want to convey. So that is, and because of that, and many of the patients who comes to hospital, if they are diseased, if we talk about the prevalence of uncontrolled diabetes, anyway the scenario is very bad in India, and for that matter worldwide. Almost 70% patients have a HbA1c of more than 7. So having an HbA1c of 7 is actually a dream which will never going to be true. So that is why the intra-operative management becomes very intra-hospital hyperglycemia management becomes very important. And since we all are dealing with this hyperglycemia and diabetes in all branches, it's not just for us who can cater to this, the large burden of the patients. We all have to become the party of this management strategy. And so that the basic, especially for residents, the basic knowledge of insulin, types of insulin, administration of insulin, and then what are the cutoffs which we use, what is, in terms of both on the higher side, hyperglycemia, hypoglycemia, everyone needs to be aware of. So the basic minimum knowledge is, I think, is required for every specialty, whether they directly deal with diabetes or not. So as such, there is no formula. The only thing which we need to remember is that HbA1c is being expressed in terms of percentage. So just having a low hemoglobin is not going to change the HbA1c. That's the concept needs to. It's a percentage of whatever hemoglobin is there. Until unless that low hemoglobin is because of the rapid turnover of RBCs. That means it's a basically hemolytic anemia that is going to affect the HbA1c values, not just the value of hemoglobin of 8, because it's ultimately expressed in terms of percentage. So if there is rapid turnover because of underlying hemolysis, then only we will have a falsely low values in terms of HbA1c compared to what is actually the glycemic level of the patient. So that's one thing. Having said that, yes, that is one of the, I think the point of it to be discussed, that we should not read too much in HbA1c value in a sick patient, especially like CKD, like CLD patients. There are a lot of fallacies with HbA1c assay, but I think that would be little out of the scope for this thing. So, but so rather we should rely, especially as long as the patient is in the hospital, on blood sugar measurements. Now, blood sugar measurements are also is very critical. What kind of instrument you are using it? How many actually know that there are two different kind of glucometer which are being marketed by companies for hospital purpose and the home-based monitoring. We cannot use the same glucometer which are being, which are being sold generally at pharmacies. Those companies actually provide the dedicated glucometers only for hospital supply. The reason being that because in hospital we will get or deal with patients who are sick. Like one of the factors is low hemoglobin. Some of them actually have hypotension. Some of them actually have an hypoglycemia, hypoxia. So everything, and the method of estimating glucose is the glucose oxidase enzyme dependent method. So anyone who is on oxygen therapy or hypoxia, hypotension, tissue perfusion is poor, all those values are going to be affected. So before we take any action based on any glucometer readings, we need to put the clinical insight into that value. That is another important message before we discuss the theoretical part of it. So sometimes the readings comes 50, but patient is sitting and talking in front of you. So be careful before we correct hyperglycemia. So these are some clinical points which we will discuss in between as a part of a discussion also. So I think this is the theoretical slide. We all need to know that of 1 out of 4 patients who's getting admitted in hospital are actually having diabetes. That's one thing. And there are some almost 10 to 15% patients who are not even aware about diabetes, and it's mean the diagnosis is being made first time in the hospital as a part of preoperative workup or during monitoring. Why then why it is important? Of course, all the multiple studies across the time period have shown the higher morbidity and mortality in diabetic patients in terms of increased hospital stay, increased infection rate. Now, this is again a theoretical slide, busy slide. It just shows that how does hyperglycemia, hypoglycemia, and third is the important component which is now evolving is the glycemic variability. Two people with HbA1c of 8 actually can have different values because HbA1c is just an average. But average can be 100 plus, 120 plus 80, or it can be 180 and 20 also. So there can be extreme hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia also, but the average will come same. So this is now the more and more emphasis is now being given in glycemic variability. Again, so ultimately all these things needs to increase inflammation, increase oxidative stress, increased plaque instability leading to increased cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. Again, as we go up the ladder in terms of severity of the diseases, prevalence of either known diabetes or increased blood sugar resulting from stress goes up. So highest prevalence of dysglycemia is seen in ICU patients, CTVS post-CABG patients, then post-surgery patients, and so on. So of course, like the prevalence of dysglycemia in ICU is going to be around 70 to 80%. At one point or other point of time, depending on the stage which we are dealing. So this is what we have discussed, that there is increased risk of morbidity, mortality, hospital, surgical site infections, increased hospital stay, higher admissions to ICU, and increased post-discharge care. Now, what are the evidence? So these are the studies which probably are the landmark studies which have shaped us the way we treat indoor hyperglycemias. So this first one was the Vandenberg study that first time showed that the glycemic management standard actually affects your hospital outcome. They give certain cutoffs, we will not go into detail, and that was followed for some period of time. Then came the second one. Directly I'll go to the NICE sugar study. It was published way back when we used to be in MD. In NEJM, which in the first study showed the tide control gives you better outcome, and from there we got the cutoff of this 142, that pre-meal sugar should be less than 140 and post-meal sugar should be less than 180. So then there was an attempt, 140 say but outcome better hota hai, then can we target more intensive control of blood sugars? So then the next trial came is the NICE sugar study, which was a multi-center study. What they do, why not try to target euglycemia? So they decided and divided into two groups. One is 80 to 108 and other group was 140 to 180, the standard control. So again, this study showed that actually when you go too low, then the mortality, the assumption is that maybe you are making them euglycemic, the outcome is going to be better, but it was not found in this study. In fact, the outcome was worse in the tighter control study patients. The reason being hypoglycemia. That contributed most of the mortality. So again, it has to be a balance between the hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia. And again, the targets which you decide for a patient depends on the clinical situation. Now, someone who is in oncology admitted with on a palliative care, and we are trying to achieve a blood glucose of less than 140 or 180, where intake is poor. That's again. So targets also needs to be customized. In that scenario, probably what we are trying to give is avoid the hyperglycemic symptoms. So anything around 200 is also okay. So it has to be pragmatic, practical, and situation oriented in which we are with the patients. So and another just one thing I want to highlight this. Amperez et al. It was a landmark rabbit trial. What they do basically, I think most of us know the name of sliding scale, and most of us have used that scale to control the blood sugars in hospital stay till a particular point of time. And even our seniors also, it was like the only way of treating blood sugars during hospital. This trial showed first time that sliding scale leads to actually poor control and leads to more hyperglycemia or hypoglycemias. Because in what we used to do in sliding scale, it's a reactive approach. We always like to do that scale of 0 to 150, then withhold insulin 150 to 200, 2 unit, 200 to 400. So what we used to do, we were first allowing the sugars to go above the 150 and then give. And then when sugar goes down, again the hold. So it's basically roller coaster ride. So nowadays, in short, sliding scale are not being used. Now something what we used as is basal bolus corrective scale, which I think Dr. Sumega is going to discuss. So so sliding scale, probably we should stop using it. That's one message we want to convey to all the residents now, that we have a much better way of dealing with indoor hyperglycemia. So with this, I will hand over this session to Dr. Sumega, and then we'll discuss one aspect at a time and in detail with your questions and inputs. Thank you.
Our topic for discussion is in-hospital dysglycemia, a highly relevant issue in current clinical practice. So defining the spectrum of in-hospital dysglycemia. So, hyperglycemia is blood glucose levels more than 140 mg per deciliter fasting and more than 180 mg per deciliter post-meal or persistently. Severe hyperglycemia is when the blood glucose is more than 250 to 300 mg per deciliter, especially with ketosis, acidosis, or osmotic symptoms often requiring IV insulin. Hypoglycemia is blood glucose less than 70 mg per deciliter. Severe hypoglycemia is blood glucose less than 54 mg per deciliter or any hypoglycemic episode requiring assistance. Glycemic variability is wide glucose fluctuations around more than 50 to 100 mg per day swings in a day. Stress hyperglycemia is blood glucose more than 140 to 180 mg per deciliter in patients without known diabetes, typically in acute illness on steroids or during surgery. Now, screening and diagnosis of in-hospital dysglycemia. So, during admission, we screen the patients who are known diabetic or are in acute illness, use of steroids, total parenteral nutrition, vasopressors, they have osmotic symptoms or are in altered sensorium and with unexplained infections. The basic investigations are random blood glucose, fasting plasma glucose and HbA1c. There are some advanced diagnostic tools like stress hyperglycemia ratio, which is calculated by dividing the admission blood glucose with estimated average blood glucose, which we calculate from HbA1c. So if the SHR is more than 1.14, that means there is increased risk of ICU mortality even in patients who are not diabetic. Now, role of HbA1c in hospitalized patients. HbA1c is one of the most valuable tools in the inpatient setting. So, if a patient presents with hyperglycemia, if a patient presents with hyperglycemia with no prior diagnosis of diabetes, HbA1c can help us to detect it. It reflects chronic glycemia over the past 8 to 12 weeks. HbA1c can differentiate between pre-existing diabetes versus stress hyperglycemia. If there is a patient with hyperglycemia and the HbA comes to more than 6.5, that means the patient is a pre-existing diabetic. But if the HbA1c levels are normal, that means it is due to stress hyperglycemia. Now, according to ADA 2025 guidelines, they recommend HbA1c at admission if diabetes status is unknown and the blood glucose is more than 140 mg per deciliter. The RSS DI 2022 guidelines say that HbA1c more than 6.5% is diagnostic for diabetes. Now, hyperglycemia during hospitalization is driven by multiple mechanisms, even in patients without prior diabetes. During illness or surgery, the body mounts a stress response which leads to increase in counter-regulatory hormones like cortisol, epinephrine, glucagon, all of which have action opposite to insulin and increase the blood glucose levels. They cause increase in hepatic glucose output and increased glucose uptake by the peripheral tissues. Inflammation worsens the insulin resistance. Cytokines like TNF-alpha and interleukin-6, they reduce insulin sensitivity in liver and muscles. Some of the medications like corticosteroids, catecholamines, thiazides, phenytoins and calcineurin inhibitors also cause hyperglycemia in hospital. Patients on enteral or total parenteral nutrition, especially with high glucose load, can also worsen the hyperglycemia.
Sometimes we take actually stress hyperglycemia as a lesser harmful entity than diabetic patients having a higher blood sugars. Actually, it is other way around. The stress hyperglycemia indicates the severity of underlying illness. So if your sugars, if someone who is not diabetic and having a blood sugar of 400, 500, that person actually have a risk of poorer prognosis compared to a diabetic patient having a 400 and 500 blood sugars, because that underlies that under the process which is driving hyperglycemia is much more severe, probably much more widespread. So please take stress hyperglycemia even if the patient is non-diabetic seriously and can try to control it to improve the outcomes. And it can act actually as one of the prognostic marker in these patients, especially medically ill, multi-organ dysfunction patients in ICU.
We see a lot of hypothyroidism in pregnancy. Do we also see hyperglycemia in pregnancy?
Yes, nowadays it's very common. Gestational diabetes in pregnancy, like almost 3 or 4 out of 10 women are having this thing. Especially by the end of 6th or 7th month, it's pretty common now.
Definition is also different.
Yeah, and that of course definition of gestational diabetes is different from overt diabetes or pre-existing diabetes.
Now, as per ADA 2025 guidelines, the starting threshold for initiating or intensifying insulin is more than 180 mg per deciliter. For most non-critical patients, the target blood glucose levels are recommended at 100 to 180 mg per deciliter. For selected patients like critically ill patients who are undergoing high-risk surgeries, tighter control of around 110 to 140 mg per deciliter. ADA also allows a relaxed goal of up to 250 mg per deciliter for special populations like terminally ill individuals with short life expectancy or patients with advanced kidney failure or with higher risk for hypoglycemia. According to the RSS DI 2022 guidelines, the starting threshold for initiating insulin remains the same, which is more than 180 mg per deciliter. For most non-critically ill patients, we aim for a target range of 140 to 180 mg per deciliter. And for critically ill patients, we aim for a tighter control of 110 to 140 mg per deciliter. Now, understanding the physiological insulin secretion is central to designing the inpatient insulin therapy. The endogenous insulin is secreted in 2 phases. The basal insulin is secreted continuously and the prandial insulin is released in 2 phases. The first phase is the early spike and the second phase is the sustained release. In fasting state, the basal insulin suppresses the hepatic glucose output, and during meals, the prandial insulin manages the post-meal glucose excursions. Now, this table outlines the major insulin types we use in hospital. The selection should be based on the onset, peak and duration of action of the insulin. Rapid-acting insulin like Lispro, Aspart and Glulicine have the onset of action at 10 to 20 minutes, which peaks in 1 to 2 hours with a total duration of 3 to 5 hours. Short-acting insulin, like regular insulin, the onset is in 30 to 60 minutes, peak in 2 to 4 hours, and a total duration of 6 to 8 hours. Intermediate acting insulin, like NPH, the onset is in 1 to 2 hours, with peak in 6 to 10 hours and duration of 12 to 18 hours. We have long-acting insulin like Glargine and Detamir with onset in 1 to 2 hours with no peak and a duration of 24 hours. And ultra-long-acting insulin like Degludec with onset in 1 to 4 hours and no peak and duration of more than 36 hours.
Just stay there slide because they are resident. So just want to put into perspective in our hospital practice so that we becomes more familiar. So as a part of a policy in our hospital, we are no longer the NPH is not available actually as of now. So NPH was supposed to be used a decade or 2 decades back. Now we are not using NPH. So except certain specific scenarios, which I think scope of beyond this discussion. So we use it basically in steroid-induced hyperglycemia. Otherwise, what we are using is short-acting insulin or rapid-acting insulin, depend for prandial coverage, and we are using long-acting insulin, most commonly the Glargine, and in some special cases, maybe Degludec. Otherwise, what you will see always in the charts is the Glargine and the short-acting insulin. Now, depending which we select, short-acting versus rapid-acting, there are a lot of issues in terms of economics, financial conditions and all, because the rapid-acting analogs are little expensive and short-acting ones, that is human insulin, what we call HIR or Actarapid, it is known as commonly, is a short-acting insulin. It's cheaper versus rapid-acting, which are analogs like Lispro or Aspart, they are much expensive. So we have to see the status of the patients and scheme and non-scheme kind of thing. The only thing which I want to highlight is whenever we have a choice, we prefer to go for analogs. The reason being 3. The analogs, as you can see, can be given, even just prior to meal because the onset happens after 10 to 20 minutes only. So that is one advantage because in hospitals, sometimes, we have a full ward full of the patients and then we have 1 or 2 staff. Now they have to give insulin at particular point of time. At that time the canteen or the pantry may not be able to reach. They don't know exactly what time the food is going to enter into the ward. So they always try to give the insulin when the food is there on the table. Because if they give it half an hour before, that what it should have been done with actually short-acting insulin, because it takes time for onset of action around 20 to 40 minutes. So if they give half an hour before and there is a delay from pantry and the food is not there with the patient, they will end up into actually hypoglycemia. So all the staffs do it immediately before when the meal is being put on the table of the patients. But when they do that thing, there is always a delay in terms of onset of action, and many of the patients will actually end up with hyperglycemia even if you've given the right doses to the insulin. So with analogs, there is the advantage that you can give it just before the meal. In fact, with newer analogs, you can give it after the meal. So that's one thing. It is more easier to deal with the time schedule of delivery of the food and patients. Second, the patients sometimes have erratic appetite during hospital stay in terms of they may have anorexia because of the drugs, because of the illness and all. So we don't know how much they are going to eat. They may have a half a chapati and then stop. Now we have given the full dose of insulin. So they may land up into hypoglycemia. Now analogs gives us the flexibility of using it after the meal. So if we know that this patient's appetite is variable or erratic, we don't know how much is going to eat. So you can let them have the meal and then can give insulin after the meal depending on the quantity he has taken. So you've taken the full meal, give the full dose. You've taken the half meal, you can give half dose or maybe 25% depending on the other parameters. So that's, in fact, we have now analogs which can be given even up to 20 minutes after the meal. So these two are the basic differences, and depending on that we decide. Sometimes you have seen in your hospital chart with various specialty there we always write sometimes HIR, sometimes we write analogs. The reason is that only we have to select and see what kind of patients we are dealing with, of course taking into account the economics of the patients.
The current status of insulin mixtures 30-70, 50-50. We used very often these mixtures.
Yes, I think, but that, sir, is more probably of for a comfort rather than a scientific basis of using it, because with a mixture you are always stuck within a fixed ratio. Now, especially in hospitalized settings, sometimes you need a you need bolus component more, basal component less. That kind of flexibility is not there with pre-mixed insulin. So generally we avoid using, or none of the guidelines actually shows that you use the mixed start. I think mixed start is the one everyone is aware of, 30-70 kind of insulin. So we do not use any kind of pre-mixed insulin during, especially in hospital stay. Outdoor setting, stable patients, that's a different scenario. We'll discuss some other time. But during hospital stay, we always try to use two components separately so that we have a flexibility of using them independently and titrating them, because sometimes CKD patients, CLD patients, they do not require long-acting component because their hepatic glucose output, for that matter CLD, is very low. They actually have fasting hypoglycemia, so we don't want long-acting components. So using them separately will help us to decide what we want, what we do not want. Thank you. So even if the patient who is at home at 30-70, we transition them to basal bolus whenever they are in the hospital or therefore for the procedure.
Now, when should we initiate insulin therapy in hospital? If more than 2 readings of random blood glucose are more than 180 milligram per deciliter, if the patient is a non-diabetic and is in stress hyperglycemia, in steroid-induced hyperglycemia, patients on parenteral or enteral feeding patients, or glucose with more than 300 milligram per deciliter or in diabetic ketoacidosis. Now, defining the glycemic targets, this slide addresses the grey zone areas which we encounter all the time, like the frail elderly and the post-op patients on RT. In such cases, your target range must be safe and not rigid. For example, if we have a 75-year-old woman with dementia and CKD, she should not be pushed to achieve a target of around 110 milligram per deciliter. Likewise, the patients on tube feeds, they need proper insulin strategies and not just reactive insulin correction. Now, when to stop OHAs and shift to insulin? When the blood glucose is persistently more than 180 milligram per deciliter, we start insulin and try to meet the glycemic targets. In ICUs, or the patient is in sepsis or in critical illness, we stop all OHAs and use IV insulin. If the patient is nil per oral or has reduced oral intake, we stop OHAs and use basal plus minus correction scales. Likewise, in acute illness or if IV contrast is planned where we cannot use metformin, so we hold metformin for 48 hours till 48 hours post contrast.
So again, just to simplify it, any patient in ICU, IV insulin, especially any patient in ICU or any kind of inodrop support, it's the IV insulin which is preferred, because subcute insulin may not have a proper absorption because of the hypotension and poor perfusion. So IV insulin we go for. Otherwise, we try to keep them on basal bolus, basically on subcutaneous insulin therapy, because any patient who is conscious oriented, eating well on inodrops, even if they are in ICU, we try to keep them on subcute insulin, because when we keep patients in ICU and on IV infusion, we need to check blood sugars every hourly or 2 hourly. Now this looks very simple, but it takes lots of energy and human resources to do the sugars every hourly. But whenever there is an infusion, that is the protocol, every hourly or 2 hourly. But when we do subcute insulin administration, it's like 6 times or 4 times a day, depending on the patient profile. So anyone who is inodrops, IV insulin, non-inodrops, we go for subcute insulin. So that is one thing. And then second is sometimes in patients with RT feeds, because there is no breakfast, lunch and dinner. So the timing of insulin is being set based on the fixed time interval. Time 8 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 2 o'clock, then again 6 o'clock, then 12 o'clock. The only thing which I want every resident to remember is, because in most of the time in our hospital we are using bolus RT feeding. So it is not a continuous RT feeding that is going on for 24 hours. The last meal goes around 10 o'clock. So after that, we should try to avoid giving any insulin because patient do not receive any kind of nutrition there. It is generally in a Western country, we generally follow the continuous infusion even through the RT. You give keeps at fixed rate, which is not there in our case. The reasons are logistical issues and other. So in RT feed patients, be careful about the hypoglycemia during the night time. That's we need to remember. That's it. And the TPN patients, we generally put insulin in the TPN to correct it so that it can match the rate of infusion of the TPN.
What about the cutaneous monitors?
Okay. So that's a good question. Actually, now everyone is talking about CGM devices now, but for again the same reason. The CGM devices or the continuous glucose monitoring devices are being approved basically for outdoor settings. This approval has not been extended to the indoor settings or in hospital settings because there are issues with CGM. Not everything which is expensive or new is actually good. So that is before we jump onto that thing, we need to remember that thing. So the approval is for outdoor setting because in indoor setting there are a lot of technical issues. The principle they work, the tissue perfusion, hypotension, hypoxia, everything affects the glucose reading, the pH and everything. So they have been designed to work in a particular environment. We cannot extrapolate one thing to another. So as of now, the bottom line is CGM is not for indoor admitted patients.
Now, all in-hospital insulin dosing follows the basal bolus model. Now, this slide tells us how to calculate the total daily dose of insulin required, which has to be individualized. So, if a patient is frail, elderly, or has a renal disease, the total daily dose will be 0.3 units per kg per day. For a general stable patient, it will be 0.4 units per kg per day. For an obese or steroid treated patient, it will be 0.5 to 0.6 units per kg per day. After calculating the total daily dose, we divide 50% of it is given as basal dose and the rest 50% is given as prandial dose, which is split into 3 doses as per the meals. For example, if there is a 45 kilogram elderly female, the total daily dose will be 0.3 into 45, which comes to 13 units per day. The basal will be half of 13, around 6 units glargine at bedtime, and prandial will be 2 to 3 units as part or lispro before meals. And correction plus 1 unit more than if RPS is more than 180 milligram per deciliter.
Again, just want to highlight one thing. These are all initiating doses. These formulas are all initiating doses. This is just give an idea how to initiate. Now this doses depends on lots of factors, and everyone require different dosing regimes. We cannot just give a one dose to everyone because of the change in variation in the weight, because of the variation in terms of underlying illness, CKD, CLD, nutritional intake. It also depends on what target you want to achieve, how rigid you want to be, whether patient is having sepsis underlying or not, infection will require or not, whether someone is on steroid or not. So this is just the initiating dose, and the dose will be modified, should be modified every day based on what sugar we get. So again, this message is to all the residents, please make sure their sugars get checked, and they should be entered into our hospital's indoor hyperglycemia management sheet. There is a blue color sheet, I think most of you have seen that thing. There is a sheet for SMBG monitoring. So please make sure your staff or just supervise them that all the readings are entered into that, because the next day dose will be decided based on the readings which we have got on the previous day. Sometimes we still see the empty columns there. So that is again the practical message which we want to go back and emphasize to our staff, to our supporting healthcare staff. Just fill that form so that we can decide the next day dose. If that is not there, we are actually hampered we can't assist you in a best possible way if we do not have the desired information with us. Thank you.
Now, correctional insulin. Correctional insulin, it refers to additional rapid-acting insulin which we administer before meals or if the patient is NPO every 6 hours based on real-time glucose values. We have to use it as supplemental dosing alongside basal and bolus regimen and not as monotherapy. Now, guideline according to ADA 2025.
So the basic difference that has happened is we used to use sliding scale. Sliding scale used to be short acting insulin only. Okay, so इतना शुगर आया इतना लगाना है. तो आया उसके बाद आप लगा तो that's a reactive strategy. Other strategy is that you preempt the sugar, what is going to be it, based on your previous day experience, and you take that into factor in designing the next day dose, and then you give it. So nowadays what we do is 3 component of insulin administration. One is the bolus dose, that is short acting insulin. Another is the basal. Sliding scale never used the basal insulin. So basal is the new component that was added. Third is the correctional component. Okay, once you give the basal dose, once you give the bolus dose before meal, and then you check the sugar after 2 hours, and then you notice, okay, whatever we have given, but still it is not being able to correct the blood sugar. अभी भी sugar खाने के बाद 250 आया. Now what should we do? So then we give correctional dose, so that at least next meal के पहले sugar ठीक हो जाए. So that is called as correctional insulin. So 250 आया तो कितना correction देना है, या 300 आया तो कितना correction देना. So that is this formula. So nowadays every insulin regime in indoor settings have 3 components: basal, bolus, and correctional. So these 3 components we need to be aware of. If you see our again hospital's indoor hyperglycemia sheet, there is a bolus insulin. Pre-meal we always write before breakfast, before lunch, before dinner. Then we write basal insulin, and on the back of the sheet you must have seen the correctional scale also. So these 3 components we use to correct the insulin. Now idea is to give lesser and lesser correction, because at the end of the day correction means something has happened and you are correcting it. So it is again a reactive strategy. So the good thing is that if you cannot send the patients every day to endocrine OPD, or we as a part of logistics, it's difficult to go and see every patient in each ward of diabetes every day. So that correctional scale, it means that everyone who is dealing with diabetes need to see how much correction was given previously, and that correction should be added onto the next day of pre-meal insulin. So that is the message which we want to convey from here. So that over a period of time the correction should happen lesser and lesser. It means आप correction नहीं कर रहे हैं का मतलब आपका जो sugar बढ़ ही नहीं रहा है, तो आपको correction देने की जरूरत ही नहीं. So that is again the point. So every day the dose needs to be revised based on the previous day of correctional insulin given, so that the spikes do not happen at all, so that there is no need to give corrections.
Now this slide, according to ADA 2025 and RSSDI guidelines, they do not recommend sliding scale as monotherapy. As sir already said that it is reactive insulin based on blood glucose alone, and we use the same fixed dose for wide glucose range, and there is no relation to meals or nutrition. So the Rabbit True trials and multiple other trials also have confirmed the same. So how to decide the regimen based on clinical context? First of all, we'll see if the patient is in ICU critically ill or not. If the patient is critically ill, then we give IV insulin infusion, and if not, then we give subcutaneous basal bolus or basal correction regimen. Then we have to see the nutritional status. If yes, then depending on the nutritional status, we will plan the basal bolus regimen of the patient. We now move to patients in critical care setting where insulin needs are dynamic and life-threatening dysglycemia is common. I would like to invite Dr. Prajita Pandey, SR2 from Department of Critical Care Medicine to carry the presentation forward.
Thank you, Dr. Suneka. Good morning, respected dignitaries and all my dear colleagues. We will now move on to the ICU care setting of dysglycemia. So our target goals in ICU for non-DKA patients, as discussed earlier, are around 140 to 180 milligram per deciliters of blood sugar. For selected patient, that is patients with CABG post-operative patient, we usually target blood glucose level from 110 milligram per deciliters to 140 milligram per deciliters. In special cases such as DKA and hyperosmolar syndrome, we target 150 to 200 milligrams per deciliters of blood sugar. So what are the challenges that we face during giving IV insulin? So the first challenge is hypoglycemia. For this, we do frequent monitoring, titrate the insulin according to our algorithm and add dextrose when needed. Line interruption is one of the common issues since our patients are on multimodal therapy. They are sometimes sedated, paralyzed with variable inotropic supports. So we have a dedicated IV channels and we keep checking the patency of IV channels. Staff unfamiliarity. For this, we have standardized protocol. We educate our staff on how to deliver insulin in an effective way. Insulin absorption and tubing. So when we prepare insulin infusion, we try to prime the tubing so that adequate amount of insulin is delivered to the patient. We keep on checking potassium or serum electrolyte of the patient and we replace them proactively. There are some transition errors, so we overlap it with subcutaneous insulin before stopping the infusion.
I want to emphasize again because we want to take some practical pointers from this whole discussion. The last line is very important, that is transition, and that's the biggest problem which happens everywhere, not only in our center. We stop IV insulin and we start subcutaneous insulin. But we need to understand that IV insulin has a half-life of 3 to 5 minutes. That's it. Duration of action is 3 to 5 minutes. Half-life is even less. So as soon as practically you stop IV insulin, the action is over and patient starts to get rebound hyperglycemia. So if we are planning to discontinue the IV insulin, we need to give actually long-acting insulin 2 to 3 hours prior, or for that matter, if short-acting insulin is there, then it needs to be given, especially when we are using this regular insulin or actrapid or whatever preparation, HIR, human insulin R, we need to give it at least 30 to 60 minutes before we stop the IV insulin. Especially this is very important in DKA patients because during that 1 hour there is a rebound ketoacidosis that can happen. So the whole efforts which have gone through to control the ketosis actually can go waste and it will prolong the stay in the hospital again or in the ICU. So start subcutaneous insulin at least 1 hour prior to stopping the IV infusion. That's the only message. Okay. So in terms of absorption, we are talking. So I think most of the time now we are getting plastic bottles. We are no longer having glass bottles. So it is more about the infusion set through which the infusion is passing through. So that is plastic, whether we use the glass bottle or not. So the priming is basically for that infusion set. So we need to prime that infusion set for certain period of time before we actually connect the tubing to the patient.
There are two more challenges. One is how you check the quality or your insulin glucose checking, monitoring. How you maintain the quality?
Sir, so to keep the glucose, we take the blood glucose level of the patient in which algorithm is started.
No, I am talking about how you maintain the glucose monitoring quality. You are testing it with a glucometer.
Yes.
So what happens if your glucometer is not giving the correct readings? What will you do?
Technical management.
How?
Sir, we check for the batteries of the glucometer and we get the new one.
No. So that's why I asked this question. Everywhere in every ward there is a POCT kit, point of care testing kit, which is placed with your glucometer. In that kit there are two bottles, one is of yellow color, one is of blue color. That particular blue color is for high glucose and yellow color is for low glucose. You take your glucometer, put the strip and place one drop of blue one for high glucose and then another strip, another drop of yellow one to test the low glucose. There is a range written on those bottles. If your reading is coming in those particular range, your glucometer is correct. If it is like erratic is there, then you need to send your glucometer to DME for calibration of corrections. Okay. And second, is it the only potassium you need to see?
Sir, electrolyte,
Which ones?
sodium,
Sodium and
potassium,
potassium and
chloride, magnesium.
So, okay.
Magnesium.
So I think there are a lot of things to discuss, but so we have a permission. Although I don't know, time is the. So we can do it in two parts because this is something they have to deal every day. So whenever someone is on infusion, we need to see first is potassium because that's basically intracellular iron. So it drives potassium inside the cell. So patients tends to get hypokalemia whenever they are on infusion, and in fact that small error can lead to fatal when arrhythmia. So that is one thing we need to. The second is phosphorus. So phosphorus is again intracellular iron, but when we give an insulin or in a special setting like DK, it comes out as a buffer to to neutralize the acid. So when you give insulin, the phosphorus also goes inside the cell. So there will be an hypophosphatemia. We need to correct it. Your patient is on ventilator, phosphorus is low. You will not be able to wean the patients, and your stay will increase, and infection will increase, and everything will go waste. So potassium, phosphorus, and third one is magnesium, which can go down in some of the patients. So these three electrolytes needs to be monitored when patient is on infusion, especially in a long-term setting, not for 3-4 hours, but especially for a couple of days. Then definitely you should need to monitor it. Sodium does not need to be monitored when it comes to infusion. Insulin have no action on sodium transport or chloride transport. So electrolytes means sometimes beyond sodium, potassium, and chloride. And another thing is just to add this same thing is please do not check ketones every day in a DKA patient. This practice has to now stop. Okay, we are trying, but we just because a common forum, we are again emphasizing it. Actually, the ketones we check in the urine is only for diagnosis. In fact, when you treat, the ketonuria increases over next 3-4 days. Ketones remains persistently positive for next 3 to 4 days or maybe for a week or so. Trace can come up to week. So उसको check करने से हमारा treatment decide नहीं होता है. We do either check blood ketones or if we do not have a ketone meter in our hospital, which is the case in many of the hospitals in India. So what we do is we check the either pH or bicarb, especially when dealing with DKA patients. So there is no need for checking urine ketones every day in ICU in DKA patients. In fact, it will show that it was moderate on day 1 and on day 2 it will be severe actually because again it's because in urine checks acetate, and what we actually means ketones is beta hydroxybutyrate, which is in the blood. So when you treat with insulin, beta hydroxybutyrate gets converted into acetate and get excreted into urine, and when we measure that acetate, it will show that actually ketosis is worsening. Mild से moderate हो गया, moderate से severe हो गया. So उसे नहीं check करना है. Blood ketones check करिए, otherwise just see the pH. If it is normal, then your ketosis has resolved. Second thing, again for surgery patients, patients who are NBM, sometimes blood sugars are high, and we check again the ketones, the sugar, the reflex reaction sugar is 400, check ketones, or 300, check ketones. Sometimes that ketones is because of starvation ketosis actually. So until and unless that ketone is accompanied by an acidosis, that default diagnosis should not be DKA. It is just a physiological response to in a patient who has been kept NBM or who has been nutritionally deprived. So that ketone, especially trace ketones without any acidosis, does not carry any significant meaning. So that is another message where we can we reduce our burden and panic and anxiety calls.
It's always mention of serum ketone.
Yes. So it is available. It is available in our hospital also. Sometimes the availability of the kit is the strip is little bit an issue. Otherwise, it is there in ICU. Not that expensive. It's not that expensive. The only thing is because otherwise all the guidelines, if we see worldwide, the whole treatment of diabetic ketoacidosis is based on serum ketone estimation. Yes. The few year back it was not available. Now we have a point of care, just like a glucometer, we have a ketometer device. It is available in India from Abbott. It is there in our hospital also. We use it less. The reason being maybe because we have been trained and taught in a way, we read actually in ABGs and pH and bicarbonate, and based on that we can decide indirectly that ketosis has resolved. So if the ketones is stopped being formed, then your pH will start normalizing, acidosis will start recovering, bicarb will start recovering, anion gap will start recovering. So indirectly we can say that ketosis is stopped and we don't need to keep the patients on infusion, we can shift them on subcutaneously. But urine ketones, except in the emergency when patient presents in the with higher blood sugar, where you want to make a diagnosis of DKA, or in the ward when you want to make a diagnosis of DKA, then only do the urine ketones. It should not be repeated every day. That is the very the message which we want to convey.
Transitioning from intravenous to subcutaneous insulin, when and how? So the first priority is the stable hemodynamic. When the patient is off vasopressor support and perfusion is restored, we usually shift patient from intravenous to subcutaneous insulin. Second criteria is tolerating oral or enteral nutrition, stable insulin requirements for next 6 to 8 hours, and resolution of ketoacidosis or hyperosmolar hyperglycemic state. Now, how do we calculate the subcutaneous dose that is to be delivered to the patient? So, it is average of past 6 to 8 hours of insulin requirement into 24. It is further divided into basal dose and bolus dose as discussed earlier. So, the basal dose is 50% of glargine, 15 units of night or morning, and bolus is 15 units divided into 5 units before each meal. So, we have a 65-year-old male, known case of type 2 diabetes mellitus, admitted with community-acquired pneumonia in shock requiring noradrenaline infusion at 0.2 micrograms per kg per minute. He developed a new onset hyperglycemia. He was not on prior insulin and his random blood sugar is 244 milligrams of per deciliter. So my question to the audience is, what should be started in this patient? So you're right, intravenous insulin is to be started in this patient. What are the key insulin principles in septic shock? We'll see impaired perfusion. So we'll use IV route, vasopressor support, and our dynamic insulin needs. Diagnostic criteria for diabetic ketoacidosis. So this is one of the most common complications that we deal with ICU and emergency basis. The parameters that we look forward for the diagnostic criteria are blood glucose, that should be more than 250 milligrams of per deciliter. Arterial pH should be less than 7.3. Serum bicarbonate is at the lower level, less than 18 milliequivalent per liter, and anion gap is more than 10 to 12. Serum ketones should be positive as discussed earlier. So what are our priorities? Initial fluid resuscitation. As soon as the patient arrives, from 0 to 1 hour, 15 to 20 milliliters per kg of normal saline is to be delivered. That is around 1 to 1.5 milliliters per hour. For next 1 to 2 hours, we'll increase it to 1 to 2 liter until patient is hemodynamically stable and urine output is increased to 0.5 to 1 ml per kg per hour. And blood glucose, if it is less than 250 milligrams per deciliter, we'll add 5% of dextrose with normal saline or 0.45% of normal saline at the rate of 100 to 200 milliliters per hour. Care must be taken in patients with heart failure and kidney disease. We use goal-directed fluid therapy in such patients. Insulin treatment involves bolus of 0.1 to 0.15 units per kg IV, followed by IV insulin infusion at the rate of 0.1 unit per kg per hour. Our goal is to decrease blood glucose 50 to 75 milligrams per deciliter per hour only. For DKA, goal blood glucose is 150 to 200 milligrams per deciliter until anion gap is closed. We can decrease IV insulin by 50% per hour if blood glucose decreases by more than 100 milligrams per deciliter per hour in any 1 hour period. And we can increase insulin drip by 50% per hour if change in blood glucose is less than 50 milligrams per deciliter per hour.
So just again one more clinical insight. Whenever we see a high blood glucose ketosis, the emphasis is on insulin. But just want to highlight, actually it is the fluid replacement which is more important than insulin, especially in the initial period, which sometimes get neglected. So that's again the take-home message is please, whenever patient is having DK, fluid management is very important. Insulin is a secondary and supportive role. Of course, it is must, but the initial fluid management is very important, which sometimes remains what I can say is not so much taken care of, and actually it will delay or prolong the duration of resolution of acidosis. So it is the fluid which resolves the acidosis, not the insulin actually in the initial part. So please take care of your fluid management, the rate of infusion. Most of the cases we do underutilize the fluid, and it will prolong your stay of ICU with from 1 day to actually 3 days or 4 days.
Check serum potassium before insulin administration. If it is less than 3 milliequivalent, add 60 milliequivalent of potassium chloride per liter to IV fluid. If potassium is 3.3 to 3.9, we add 40 milliequivalent of potassium chloride. If it is 4 to 5.4, we add 20 milliequivalents and so. In DKF, initial potassium is less than 3.3. Do not give IV insulin until the serum potassium is more than 3.3 milliequivalent, as there is risk of hypokalemia. So, as we discussed earlier, transition from subcutaneous insulin, closure of anion gap in DKA, serum bicarbonate improvement, and patient is able to eat. Hyperosmolar hyperglycemic state is diagnosed when osmolality is more than 320 millimoles of per kg. Blood glucose is more than 600 milligrams per deciliter. There is dehydration, hypovolemia without ketoacidosis. Management includes aggressive fluid resuscitation, fluid deficit around 8 to 12 liters in HHS. Insulin therapy is started only after initial fluid. Now in HHS we target lower doses of insulin because we don't want our sugars to come down at a faster level. Dextrose addition when blood glucose is less than 300 milligrams per deciliter. Our target blood glucose is 250 to 300. And serum osmolality is monitored and it is corrected slowly to avoid cerebral edema. This is a gist of differences between diabetic ketoacidosis and HHS. So DK is seen in younger age group and HHS is seen in older age group. There is presence of ketones in DKA. Osmolality is very high in HHS and bicarb are near normal. Mental status is mild to moderate changes we can see in DKA, and there is marked alteration in HHS. There is high risk of mortality in the HHS. Moving on to hypoglycemia in ICU. ICU patients are at high risk of hypoglycemia because of IV insulin with requirements. Sepsis, most of the patients are with sepsis, renal dysfunction. There is poor subcutaneous absorption and patients are nil per oral for long time. Prevention strategy is to always match insulin to the nutrition. If patient gets no feed, we give no bolus. If there is TPN or RT feed is interrupted, we hold the bolus and we adjust the infusion. Early blood glucose monitoring and nursing staff education is the foremost priority. So according to RSSDI and ADA 2025 guidelines, the rescue protocol involves when the patient is conscious and has oral intake, 50 to 20 grams of fast-acting carbs are given to the patient. When patient is nil per oral but with IV access, we administer 25 to 50 ml of 50% dextrose IV bolus. When there is no IV access, we give glucagon 1 milligram IM or subcute. And when blood glucose is less than 40 milligrams per deciliter, we start patient on dextrose drip or dextrose infusion at the rate of 100 to 150 milliliters per hour. Common ICU glycemic error includes subcute insulin in shock or sepsis, sliding scale insulin monotherapy, no insulin dose adjustment with TPN may lead to hypoglycemia, holding insulin during nil per oral hours, and not monitoring RBS early on infusion. So, the management of insulin with TPN and enteral feeds involve when patient is on TPN, there is continuous 24 hours pattern and risk profile includes persistent hyperglycemia. When there are RT feeds, the patient gets intermittent bolus that leads to peak of blood glucose after each feed. When RT feeds are continuous, the blood glucose are stable, but they are mildly elevated. So what to do if feeds are interrupted? TPN is stopped, so we can start D10 infusion at the rate of 100 to 150 ml per hour. When feed is paused for more than half an hour to 1 hour, we can hold the bolus and monitor the blood sugar level. And refeeding after nil per oral, we can reintroduce the insulin cautiously.
Thank you, Dr. Rajiv, for this extensive, detailed, but very practical discussion. So, seeing that this topic is very important and very important clinically, practically, so we requested Dr. Rajiv to split this presentation into two, part 1 and part 2. In part 2, we'll cover non-critical settings and some special scenarios like gestational diabetes and hypoglycemia and other things. And specifically on the request of Dr. Rajiv, we'll cover insulin injection techniques and how to give and what to take care of. We have not planned, but this very important topic fell on 25th anniversary of this VGCR. This is the 25th VGCR. We have completed 24 VGCRs. So this is a very important topic. So we will split this topic.